got there around 11:30 in the morning, and then was able to make it to both of those protests, the 12 and the 3. And just the transition time between those two protests, it was very tense. And I think that's when all the BS started, because right as the second peaceful protest is about to begin, then you hear the flashbang grenades go off and chaos ensues, people running. And from then it just transitioned to battling the police. Right. Instead of protesting for a minority of the crowd, as opposed to the majority that was trying to hear the pastors that were speaking from the second event. They brought in all of the SPD all throughout the day. They just increased the level of which policing arrives. There were a few plainclothes officers, there were the ones in tactical gears, there were the mounted police, and then there was the full battalion with the cons. I was like, oh, this isn't a peaceful protest. Or if it is a peaceful protest, you all aren't planning for it to be a peaceful protest. Yep. And prior to that moment, we drove through the city on the bus and had saw that obviously the night before, some form of protest occurred in the city because the Maserati dealership was smashed into and tagged up already before this protest even started. Which was like, okay, so there's been some shit going on. The police officers are probably tense as a result of it. But this is supposed to be a peaceful protest. And then I saw people arrive into the city, and it was like families with children and just a wide variety of people arriving. So, okay, it's going to be peaceful. There are kids here.
There were a ton, yeah.
We attended the first protest, which was on 5th and Cherry, I believe, somewhere about there. So the organizers began speaking, the crowd began flocking, and it did start to drizzle. At that point, I panned the crowd to see everyone actively listening, like responding to the speakers, holding up signs, and then you see the police force just pouring into that area. And they began to surround the crowd and block exits, not just perform crowd control, because I do believe they had a permit to, say, have the gathering at that one spot, but they did not shut down all of 5th Street. So at that point, even when it was over, we weren't really technically allowed to march down the street. We didn't have that rite of passage, which is a little confusing for me when you're attempting a march. Nonetheless, they start to close off exits. The speech ends well. There's, a bit of anger in the crowd, but the overall feel in the beginning was just, we wanted peace and we're demanding justice. There were a few outliers engaging with the cops by yelling at them, but at this point, nothing has been thrown. Just one or two people yelling at them. We tried to exit. Again, the first thing's at 12, the next thing's at 3. What are you going to do with a crowd of at least 200 people at the beginning? We try to exit, they've cut us off, and are now forcing the crowd to go in one fashion, which let me know that this was organized. They had plotted and planned what they were going to do with the crowd before any of this even happened. So they shoved us down 5th because the next protest was to be at Westlake, which is, I believe, 5th and Pine. We head that way, but I peel off and circle the block around from the crowd. It's still, at that point, chanting and marching, demanding justice. There are a few people moving, but nothing too aggressive. There's a period of time where we stopped to get lunch, and I feel like the crowd itself sort of dispersed between the two protests, not knowing what to do. Again, poor planning on these community organizers to have multiple events, but nothing to do with the crowd getting in between. Either your next protest should have been sooner, or you know what I mean? Like, there should have been a plan. You march to somewhere, and we're going to circle back. And it should be noted that the first protest happened by SPD's headquarters in the city. So they had that. We marched from SPD's headquarters on 5th to 5th and Pine, Westlake. Now, based on what's out there on the internet and folks are talking, this protest was organized in conjunction with the police officers, and they were to be passing out water to the participants. The crowd was irritated at that fact. that this was something that was in conjunction with the police officers. But when you look at who was organizing this peaceful protest, and they've organized other peaceful protests in the past, there are pastors and community activists that are speaking. The native tribe came and gave a ceremony of blessing. These people would want to work in conjunction with the Seattle Police Department, who is their stance is the mayor of Seattle and the chief of police. They condemn the actions of the Minneapolis, what happened to George Floyd, right? That's their standpoint, and that's what they've issued out. Not only their staff members, but the world. Circling back, we get to the 3 p.m. protest. Now people are lording around. More children have arrived into the Westlake Plaza. They're getting the music playing. The NWA is happening, and if you're waiting for where the speech is going to occur, down Pine, you can hear chanting and what seems like a very large crowd. So I feel like what occurred simultaneously was protesters gathered in a far distance and were marching towards this protest. And it was like 2 separate cells because there's a large amount of people already gathered in the plaza, and they were trickling in. At some point, the cops and that crowd interacted. They came, and I don't exactly know what started the onset of rioting between the 2 groups, but the building we were in front of had building security. So after the second flash bomb, like he was going in and out of the building, we didn't know that, but then he communicated what was happening at that moment in time. So you can hear these people chanting. It's now about 2 p.m. Large crowds, it's 2:15. The first flash grenade goes off, tear gas, and you see waves of crowds running. And I presume that's when that little girl was maced in the face. I tried to stop the runners and I said, "What's happening?" They said, "They're throwing tear gas because people were using Antifa tactics against the cops," which means they were running into the crowd and throwing things and running out. So antagonizing the police. It sounds like a terrible decision to me. Why would you do that? If you know anything about SPD's history and police force history, why would you antagonize them?
Right.
So that's when I was over it. I was irritated. I was disappointed. All of my, like every, I was just frustrated because as my friends ran and we got separated instantly because I wasn't running until I figured out why people were running. I see a woman with her kid in a stroller and she has no, they're behind a tree that has a fence, the metal structure in Westlake. They're standing there with her child in a stroller, and there's a couple women around her, but they're all terrified, kind of hiding to figure out what's happening. So I'm like, who's gonna help her if there is actually a outbreak of a fight here with her kid in a stroller? You know what I mean? So I run over and I'm standing with her and I'm like, "Do you have a blanket?" And that's when the gravity of this shit is hitting me. This is not only gonna get worse because it seems that was fuel for the fire. The first flash grenade, I don't know. I just something in me said this is going to be worse than you want it to be. This is not going to be a peaceful protest. And then the protest actually started. The speakers actually started speaking. So once again, the crowd gathers. We then see the security guard guy, after the second flash grenade goes off, he says, they've surrounded a cell, 1,000 people or more have surrounded police officers. So they let off the flashbang grenades to disperse the crowd because they had no exit.
Okay.
And I'm just like, in a crowd of people, you knew the area you were approaching, you knew that people were marching. The engagement of the police in this situation, when there are examples of other cities out there, how the police themselves marched with the crowd, was in front of the crowd, they kneeled in front of them. And Seattle's response from the very beginning was tactical and defense. You prepared for a war. What did you think people were going to give you? After that situation happened, I presume there were the rubber bullets. There were definitely way more bangs, and the first police car got set on fire. And eerily, around 4:15, the cops just disappeared. 4:15, 4:30, they like evacuated the area. And that's when they decided to go to phase 2 of escalation. And sure enough, the National Guard was called in, tanks were brought in, and a curfew was set. But they gave people 10 minutes to get out of the downtown Seattle area where there was no public transport, well, majority of people, I presume, took. And they had to walk out of that area to find their cars. So they had no escape path. And 10 minutes to know that there was a curfew, so being down here and gathering was illegal. And that's why there are 30 plus people in King County Jail right now. I don't know. It's a very frustrating situation and horrifying because I remember where we were pinned up and hearing the grenades go off. After the second one, I remember this kid screaming, "I don't want to die, mommy. I don't want to," like he was screaming at the top of his lungs, and he's so terrified. And I'm thinking, why are these people here? You should have left a long time ago. I understand our need to protest, but children shouldn't have been out there potentially in the first place. I think it was stupid to believe that it would have been a peaceful protest given what was happening in the world and what the Seattle Police Department's response was to what was at first a peaceful protest. And the community of color should be angry in Seattle. But what they did was not the crux of why you should be angry. If you're a person of color and you're actually from Seattle, I've heard those folks are angry because of the Weed and Seed program that essentially was to help prevent crime, but it allowed them to target communities of color. And that's why there aren't communities of color really in Seattle when you want to look at it. Who organized these events? They seem to be people out of state or very few with connections directly to the history of Seattle. And when you look at the crowd, it speaks to the diversity of Washington. But when you look to the looters and the people that were vandalizing, it does not. So Jenny Durkin has to explain why the Seattle Police Department began their approach with force. Mid-escalation by the second bang, white supremacists had arrived on site with AR-15s. So when they arrived, you can see videos on the news of the gun being snatched from this individual, and that either looked like a plainclothes officer or a security guard that had been removing their guns from them at gunpoint in an aim to de-escalate the situation that was happening. So it very, very, very quickly went out of control and had nothing to do with the original message of the protest. I don't know. Thoughts like on your experience down there? Where were you during those phases of what I just laid out?
Yeah, I got to Seattle about 11:30, took up the bus from Tacoma, got to the police station. I was one of like the earlier folks there. And I did all this alone, which I knew was maybe like a little bit naive, but I just had faith that I would figure it out. I know downtown Seattle well. I've spent a lot of time down there and pretty savvy in the city. So I was like, I got this. Like, I'm somewhat prepared. My husband's phone number on my arm. I just wasn't sure what to expect, but I wasn't going to go in like with my eyes closed as to what could happen. Like, I was aware what could happen. And you just got to think that you'll make the best decisions in the moment. So I got there to the first protest, met like a couple that invited me to stand with them. And yeah, like right away, the cops were setting up. And then they were bringing the barricades closer. And just like the energy, like you're totally right. It was like they were setting up for a combat almost. Like they had the stoic faces. People are going up to them or trying to say like substantive things like, how can you sleep at night or whatever? Like, what are you going to do to make this better? And they're just like, they're in, I don't know what they call it training wise. They're in that mode. They're not engaging as people right now. I think cops should be people, but that's a different story. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I agree with you. Cops should be people.
I only
They
know
should be humane.
They should be humane. We should be able to talk to them about these things. If we can't talk to them about these things, then how are we going to be able to change it? Like when they turn into robots, like that's not helpful.
I feel like that's a systemic thing. Well, this goes back to slavery. Like pretty much everything systemic against people of color just goes back to slavery and the mentality and the justification that they spread throughout the culture and the nation, that people of color are not equal. We're not the same species almost, because they needed to do this to justify how they could treat somebody like this and still follow their Bible and be so religious. It was like, well, because these people aren't the same as us. They're less than. And it's that same mentality has kind of been fed and bred throughout our culture. Like, even though it's kind of like a little bit in the background and it's not as direct as it used to be, but it's still definitely there. And then when people find an excuse and a reason to be able to let that side of them out, it comes out in full force. Yeah. And then when you see systemic issues and systemic organized groups that have this mentality and try to mask it, once you have a situation like that, there's always a few that are just waiting for the opportunity. And then once one goes, it's a shitstorm because they all are behind this wall of blue or whatever they call their code and just standing up for each other regardless if the person is right or wrong. Like watching videos of an officer pinning down a guy on the street that wasn't fighting back while the other cops are standing there with mace guns telling everybody to stay back. Why don't you have the same rage everybody around you has at the fact of what's going on behind you? Like, that is a serious problem.
I've seen videos today of two officers zip tying someone, and one of the officers had his knee on the neck, and the crowd goes insane. And he hears the yelling. I think he tunes in. He realizes he's being videotaped, and he grabs the officer's leg and yanks him to where his knees are on the dude's back. It was that one little thing. That one thing. All you had to do was acknowledge that, okay, maybe this action or what we're doing could put this guy's life at risk. Let's change it. That no one took in the case of George Floyd. That they didn't obey the one directive or the first directive of being a police officer is rendering aid. No one of the actual original protesters arrived with guns. They were the white supremacists that brought weapons. So you can't even say protesters were the same people antagonizing them and actually escalating the level of danger. It was not them. It got so frustrating being down there trying to figure out the whys, to see people giggling and skipping and, you know what I mean, in glee of the mayhem that was happening. I can't remember the full march. The 3 p.m. was supposed to be a march from Westlake to a different area. And it may or may not have happened because it became a war zone to walk down that street. And at that point, folks were just running left and right and trying to get out of the city. The folks that were interested, others were battling at that point.
Can you imagine too if the cops could approach this in a proactive perspective or help people get their message out? If they were like, okay, we acknowledge that people are in pain and people are going to be pouring into downtown Seattle tomorrow. There's 2 different events going on, and on Facebook it's clear that they're not really chatting. Like, even going into the protest, protesters know that it's not this one streamlined thing. What if they helped facilitate that conversation and got the permits necessary and helped people get out there safely and didn't approach it as if these protesters are their enemy?
Exactly.
Then yesterday could have been talking about how there wasn't that militaristic approach at the protests where white people had guns and were like on the Capitol steps. Like, that's a potentially dangerous situation. And we just are like, oh, whatever. I've been to the women's marches, 2017 and then 2018. The cops are there like smiling on the side of the road, right? Like, they're like, woo, you know, they're almost wearing pussy hats. And like, as a protester, it makes you feel like, yeah, like my city loves this cause. This is amazing. Yeah. And then yesterday was not like that. And it just doesn't make sense. Yeah, it's dumb. they could have done that. It's a missed opportunity, and they showed their true colors, right? So it's just like, well, what do you want people to do then? You know?
You showed them that you don't care.
Right. Perception is so skewed. There's so many different perceptions of what happened yesterday. But yeah, I mean, it was scary being there amongst families at 2:30. There was this family walking down, kind of like the scenes that you saw, maybe two families, and they had like 4 young children with them. And maybe this 9-year-old girl is crying into her mask, and her mom's like, I'm so sorry. We just came here to speak our truth. And I'm so sorry that this happened. All these kids have trauma now, and it could have been that beautiful day, like the Women's March. Those little girls get to march.
Yeah. They used fear. That's exactly it. What you were saying with about perception is that Seattle police did not honestly understand or willingly ignored the perception of a mass amount of police officers and tactical gear would have on a crowd. You created fear. And when you create fear, it's a fight or flight response you're going to get. So that led to panic crowds running. You then created more fear by actually causing explosions. You could hear the walls shake down there. You know what I mean? Like, it was so loud echoing down there. So why wouldn't you know coming out in mass would create fear in a very large crowd that are already on the edge of what is happening in the community, what is happening in the world. So, like, I just think that it was poorly done. Kashima Swant is a Seattle council member. She called Mayor Jenny Durkan out after the riots downtown, and she said Swant and the entire city council have invited Durkan, Police Chief Carmen Best, and the Seattle Fire Chief Harold Scoggs to brief the council on detailed incident reports and policing procedures during the demonstrations. So they put out the curfew, but her statement was, shame on Mayor Durkan for using the cover of COVID crisis to crack down on protesters. Durkan and the local established politicians who claim to be saddened by the murder of George Floyd have enabled a systematic racism and violence from the Seattle Police Department. She said Durkan and political establishment are also preparing to carry out brutal austerity and cuts to the social programs, which will disproportionately affect the communities of color unless our movements fight back. And they reject the crocodile tears of Mayor Durkan and the local Democratic establishment because in 2018, every Democrat in City Hall voted for the Seattle Police Officers Guild contract, which rolled back the limited police accountability. So on top of what was happening out and about, many people were like protesting that they were able to turn off their body cams. And that I'm still trying to figure out. There was a claim that they no longer had to keep them on. And I don't know if that was just for the protest or in general, they were going to turn off the body cams. And Kashima said, I was the only one that voted no on the city council to that limited police accountability. And if you really listen to the people that were speaking at the protest, that was one of the major points, is that we need to have more accountability and independent oversight of police departments, because if we did, individuals wouldn't have 3 and 4 times to have misconduct charges brought against them. But we can paint the flag.
People are so scared to stir shit up. You guys see it too, for sure. But like, as this is coming open, people get so defensive. And like, I'm starting to see it in all of my communities all over the place, right? Like, people stay stuck. People have fear around it, and it's crazy. But we have to have this conversation.
Until you acknowledge all of those facts and then actually work to fix the beginning, until you do that, then you'll never get it.
We can't fix the beginning. Like, we just have to try to make changes for now. Mm-hmm. Like, I've been doing a lot of research, just my ancestry, and it brings up a lot of stuff because you hit a roadblock for most African Americans at a certain point. Luckily, my father's mother, her line, I can trace all the way back, mother and father, all the way back to like Scotland. But my father's father, his line only goes back about 2 or 3 generations before it hits an obvious slave because she has a birth year and a death year, and the fact that she appeared to have married the slave master and had a son, but the son's still listed as a servant. So continuing that research, I found a woman who was born of a slave master, had a son by a slave master, and there was a law, I guess an old English law, that you are whatever your father is. So she was free. She should have been free. She was held as an indentured servant while all of the case and stuff was going through. Her husband, who she was in servitude to before he died, ended up passing her off to someone else for an indentured servitude. So he didn't even free her. So she ended up still continuing the case. She won, and her son were considered free English people. But soon thereafter, they changed the law, of course, so that any person of color that was born would follow the mother's line. So if your mother is Black, then you are Black and you don't have rights as an English person. And of course, it was the female slaves that were being raped off. It's always going to be your mother that was Black. So yeah, it's so institutionalized, and at every turn where we found a way to like scream our rights, they just changed the law. They changed the game, you know? So where do you go after you keep hitting wall after wall after wall after wall if it's inbred in the very government that we have to abide by?
There's a lot of, I don't know, things that are out there that they have to atone for. To atone, you really need to work to change the system you have. Do it by showing face, because they start these governmental initiatives, and that whole as slow as government work statement is not wrong. It takes forever for anything to go through. So you want to do research, you want to talk to people, but why are we having to have surveys and question what the people think right now when you could log into social media and find out what people think? Why are we doing this long process and research to come up with a program that's going to serve the people when you could tap in and find out what the people want? You could literally just ask them and actually listen. It's all for show. One of the pastors that were speaking at the second protest, when it actually got started, he had such an amazing thing to say. He's like, I'm out here. I just buried my 9-year-old nephew yesterday. And during COVID-19, ran out of funds to be able to pay for my dialysis. So basically, I'm going to die. And I'm here today to protest what is happening. And I'm here because we need guidance. And that people need to know what to do, what the next steps were. And that was, I feel, the purpose of this protest. And it was just covered by all the nonsense that ended up happening because of the actions of a few, you know? Like, he was out here hollering and screaming from it. You could feel the emotion coming off of him. And the crowd was there with him, that it has to end. And I just feel like it was lost. It was lost by that. So, yeah, what a crazy day. I don't know where we go from here. That's what I'm trying to figure out. How do we heal as an actual city and as a nation? I think depends on what the actions of the people running the city and nation do. And right now, it's not good.
Piss poor right now.
Yeah, it's piss poor.